last post, I've been working on two things, aside from my job, of course. The first is making a list of people who have a spot in my museum. The second is keeping Lucky out of it. I should probably elaborate on the latter. In my last post, I mentioned that Teresa's radio was on and preaching one of its sermons when I finished up her story. What I didn't mention is that it's the loudest it had been in quite a while, and a bit more aggressive. At the very least, it felt more targeted and accusatory than usual, almost beyond fire and brimstone. It felt like the end times. So I went to lock up the museum after, and give her a second chance to calm down, when Lucky raced past me into the room. I don't know what came over him. He's always been pretty careful with the things in there anytime he followed me in, but this time he rushed at the radio and attempted to tackle it onto the ground. I barely caught it before it hit the floor, and the dive to do so kinda knocked the wind out of me. Since then, he seemed a bit more anxious of the museum, but at the same time, he's been scratching at the door whenever I'm near it. I know there's some items in the museum that do make him uncomfortable. He usually avoids those if he's in there, or if he really doesn't like something, he'll hiss at it, but he's never actually tried to break something. Anyway, about my list. I think there's some names on here that aren't really likely to get asked for naturally in the comments. So I figure, when I get the itch to tell a secret and there's no request, I'll pull from those names. So, let me introduce you to Brigham. This was a couple years into my new career, so by this point, I had actually started renting an office space for meetings and had a dedicated cell phone for business calls. I also had a bigger circle of funeral homes willing to hand out my info and recommend me. So while I wasn't exactly book solid, I had fairly frequent jobs. But I still remember Ceres. She was Brigham's wife, and clearly was dealing with some intense grief surrounding his death. She still lived in the house with her youngest son, who was helping her with the necessary estate business whenever he could. So she actually wasn't calling me about the house. Instead, she wanted me to clear out his workshop behind the house, a large shed where he kept all of his tools and things he needed for his hobbies. It was much harder to tackle than the house was, and still felt like his space. The kids were too upset to do it as well, and I quickly gathered that the family had been very close-knit, with Brigham having been the doting husband and father to all three of their children. Hell, the youngest one was only a sophomore in college, so they certainly hadn't lost any of the spark in their marriage. So when she explained the job through several pauses for tears, I of course agreed to start as soon as she was ready. When I arrived just before the afternoon the next day, when both of them would be at home and easy to check in with about any important finds in his workshop, the son was the one to greet me. Before I could ask, he clarified that his mom was going through pictures for the funeral that weekend and was having a lot of difficulty with it. So he was going to take over for any other business that day. He was nice enough, took me through the house and offered me a water before heading out to the shed. But he didn't seem to be handling his dad's death much better than his mom. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes that were slightly red from either crying or rubbing at them. When his stomach growled loudly enough for me to hear it, I gently joked that while I was working, he should have enough time to get some lunch in him. He just kind of smiled at me, and I knew he probably hadn't had a meal he enjoyed in a few days. When we got to the shed that served as his workshop, I had to admit, I was a bit impressed. The shed seemed to have been a repurposed garage, at least judging by the door he had next to the main entrance. And through the window, I could see an older red car that I couldn't quite identify from outside the building. If I had to guess, it was a bit bigger than a two-car garage. With the part of the shed next to the garage door, and clearly it had been customized by the man himself. I whistled to myself in appreciation, and got the first genuine smile since I met the kid. "My dad did a good job, huh?" he asked with a hint of pride. "Yeah. Did you have the garage back here to start with?" "A one car with a one path, but it was way past grown over now. It already was when I was old enough to play back here. So Dad usually just put whatever he was working on in neutral and pushed it where the path used to be in the workshop, and the grass would be flat for a few days whenever he did." I could see the kid's eyes glistening at the memory, so I went back to business. "So I have the sheet your mom filled out. Is there anything you want to add?" He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm roughly and shrugged, so I dug the form out from my backpack for him to look over as I checked to make sure I didn't need to bother the two of them with any supplies I'd forgotten. She doesn't want anything but the papers for his estate stuff? I stopped and leaned over to read it. That's what it looks like, yeah. Didn't list any personal items or furniture anyway. What about his tools, the crafts he kept out here? Does she just want to throw them out? I could see he was getting heated, and I put a hand on his shoulder. Just tell me what you want to add. I only throw out what's obviously trash before I move on to donations and stuff. He took a deep breath before answering. I want both of those. His tools and whatever crafts he had finished. I don't think I'd be able to finish any of the half-done ones. Consider it done. Besides, you're both home, so before I take anything with me that isn't trash, I'll run it by whoever feels like they can handle checking. He considered me for a moment before handing back the form, face calm again. Thanks. I appreciate that. Of course. I've been here too. It's not the best position to be in. I promise I won't make it any harder. He nodded a little and gestured at the shed as if to say, all yours then. Before heading back inside, I couldn't tell if what I had said helped, but at least I hadn't made things any worse. I took a deep breath before heading in and immediately letting out a soft whew under my breath. It was certainly a sight to behold in there, along with the car Brigham had been working on, which I now recognized to be a 1989 Ferrari Berlinetta. He had shelves upon shelves of tools, things he had made, boxes of who knows what, and a nice workbench right in the middle with a comfy enough looking chair. The side without the car and its tools and such made me think of Geppetto's workshop from the older Disney version, just with more variety than a few toys. In fact, other than some scraps from whatever he'd been working on, along with some sawdust and unusual bits scattered on the floor, there wasn't really a need for garbage to be collected. I can't say I didn't appreciate it. As I said, my favorite part came after the first round of cleaning, and it took me less than an hour to get things sorted. So I could start digging. Brigham was certainly a man who knew how to work with his hands. In one of the boxes marked beauties, he had the folded up specs of the past cars he'd worked on, along with a before and after picture. And damn, he cleaned those old girls up good. They damn near looked new by the time he was done. From what I could find, he seemed to take them to car shows when he was done to sell them to someone who'd appreciate his hard work. And I nearly shed a tear when I found evidence that each sale had been stashed away for his kids, either for them to go to college or for them to get when they moved out. There were some wood carvings he'd painted on the shelves, all arranged in a way that implied his progress, based on the quality anyway. And although the first few were pretty rough, there was a bear, one at the end with a cardinal on his outstretched paw, that I was tempted to take for myself. That's not how I work though. I couldn't imagine his family not wanting them, particularly considering how his youngest son acted. Some other highlights included a stack of unfinished and glued together puzzles that were in frames, like portraits, some model planes that looked like they could take off at any moment, and a single ship in a bottle that he'd somehow set up to look like it was on a stormy sea using some kind of material along the bottom and some careful painting on the bottle itself. They were all beautiful and a clear labor of love, but my things are secrets. I put each item I found in organized boxes that I'd either brought folded in my bag or happened to be in the workshop, taking great care to keep them intact and safely put away, and went on to the last thing I had to check, aside from the car itself, that workbench. And I hit the goddamn jackpot. I know a lot of workbenches are different, so I'll describe this one really quickly so that everything makes sense. It was made of dark wood, maybe mahogany or something, and while one side was just a tabletop and a chair, the other was a set of 3 drawers, which means that was my main focus. The first drawer was pretty mundane if I'm being honest. Mostly pencils, pens, and paintbrushes, along with some scattered odds and ends like buttons, a small pocket knife, and a few screws. Probably just things he either used only at the desk or picked up and tossed in without thinking about it. The other 2, though, had locks. Now this was unusual, especially since they seemed to have been added later rather than coming with the workbench to begin with. I mean, made sense, the first drawer didn't have a lock to speak of, but there also hadn't been any keys in that first drawer, and that was more of an issue. I dug around that desk and a few of the individual boxes I had taken down from the shelves, despite knowing there was none in the boxes either, and I was about to give up when I looked at the desk from the floor for the first time. There, under the chair, was an out-of-place strip of silver duct tape that stood out against the otherwise soft gray swivel of the chair. I crawled over to check it out and ended up pulling the tape away altogether, and my efforts were rewarded with a small key nestled in the tape that had been on the chair. Not exactly a normal way to store a key, which meant I absolutely had to see what was in those drawers. As the first unlatched, I was disappointed at first to see they appeared to be business-related letters from over the years, along with progress notes for some of his projects and other paperwork. The guy had been a contractor up until retirement just a few years ago, and the paperwork appeared to be a mixture of personal jobs and ones he'd been hired onto. Still, my job was to sort these kinds of things. I started to separate the letters, invoices, and progress notes into personal and professional jobs, along with sorting out the dates chronologically, when I actually paid attention to one. Incident report for redacted address on 8th of June, 1978. On June 8th, at approximately 9:13 a.m., an unknown individual in a long jacket, hat, and sunglasses approached the site from the wooded area near the house. This man had not been scheduled to be there by any member of the crew, nor had the owners of redacted address let us know to expect anyone aside from the owners, Owen and Laura, last name redacted, their 2 children, and a medium-sized dog that would be kept inside as a precaution while we were working. Being the lead contractor on the job, I approached the individual to ask him why he was there, and if necessary, request he leave the premises. Normally, I wouldn't do this, since the owners could always have invited someone over or had an unexpected guest. But due to him having come from the woods in clothing that wasn't appropriate for that kind of activity, I wanted to be cautious. When asked about his business, the man replied that he needed directions to the road. The road in question was within sight of the home, though it was admittedly situated on a long driveway, and giving him the benefit of the doubt, I pointed him in that direction, and told him that if he followed the driveway down from the house, it wouldn't take him more than a few minutes to hit the road. In response, he asked if I or one of the crew could walk him to the road. Again, this road is within sight, and I had given him some fairly straightforward directions to get to it. I asked him if he could see all right, and he responded that his eyes were sensitive to light, hence the hat and the glasses. Since he had said a bit more in order to explain this, it was about this time that I realized that something didn't feel right. I can't really explain it in words, other than it was like when you watch one of those B movies where the actors don't seem to have the hang of acting yet. There was an emphasis on weird syllables, or his voice would be over-emotional or monotone at what seemed like random intervals. It didn't feel right. He just kind of stood there for a moment, and I assume he was staring at me from behind those glasses, before nodding and letting me go back to work. I looked back once I got back to what I'd been working on to see if he was heading the way I told him, and barely caught him stepping back into the tree line of the woods. If we could get a few cameras to monitor the site, with the client's permission of course, I think it might be wise. Brigham, last name redacted. I read it over a few times confused, before seeing if I could find the response. It was right next to it, and it looked like it had been paperclipped to the report at one point. Brigham, as much as I appreciate you trying to look after the crew and the clients, a weirdo coming out of the woods, then going back in because he couldn't get back to the road, isn't exactly a threat. And I'm sure as hell not putting cameras up around these folks' house just for a weirdo. I'll tell you what though, those woods are public property about 50 yards in. If anything else happens, I'll give you one of my hunting cameras to set up out there as a favor. So keep up the good work. Sean, last name redacted. As dismissive as it was, I couldn't exactly blame the guy for brushing off a weird report like that. While I would probably be just as unsettled in that situation, Sean was right. It wasn't a threat. I picked up another paper, and it was from the same job, but a week or two later. Incident report for redacted address on the 17th of June, 1979. On June 17th, at approximately 6:28 p.m., while the crew was wrapping up for the day, the individual described in the prior report, see incident report for redacted address from the 8th of June, 1979, again approached the site from the woods. this time, he only had his hat, seeing as it was late in the day, but he had it pulled down so his eyes couldn't be seen without active effort. I approached the individual and asked why he was there, admittedly a bit harshly after his behavior last time, and he asked if there was a river nearby. There was a stream not far from the property that cut through the wooded area he'd come from, so I told him so before adding that I wasn't sure where the nearest proper river was. He asked if I or one of his crew could bring him there. I can't explain it, but I got a chill up my spine. It felt like he was trying to think of a better way to get someone to go off alone with him, since the stream wasn't within sight like the road was. I sure as hell didn't trust it after how weird he acted last time. I told him pretty firmly that we were about to wrap up and leave, and that we didn't have time to walk him, however far we were from the stream. Last time he seemed confused, but this time he was a bit more pushy. He insisted that if we were about to wrap up, then he could wait for someone to walk him over after we were done, and that he would do his best not to take up too much time for whoever it was. His voice sounded pretty normal up until now, but when he argued with me, it started to jump around again, like a B-movie actor. I told him a firm no, and that the owners needed us off the property by 7 p.m., which was mostly true, so he needed to leave. He stared at me for a lot longer this time, or at least I assume he stared at me, before letting out a very slow and low, "Thank you for your time," and walking backwards into the woods. Just kept facing me the whole damn time until the trees blocked my view. If you meant it about that camera, please, I'll even pay you for it. Brigham, last name redacted. I dug into the pile a bit more eagerly now, but there didn't seem to be anything else from that job other than the breakdown of the cost, general progress report, and a handwritten receipt for the camera that made it clear he really had bought it. No pictures though, which was a shame. Now there was a window above the workbench that was likely to help Brigham keep track of the time. And feel a bit less confined, though I might be projecting a bit. And I had been half turned away from it at this point, since I had just started sorting from the floor. As I went back to my normal pattern for sorting, maybe some of the letters, I didn't feel comfortable facing away from it anymore. Since I was doing sorting anyway, I moved my operation to the bench itself and resumed what I was doing. After a few uneventful jobs worth of paperwork, there was another incident report from a different job 2 years after the one I'd read. Incident report for redacted address on the 5th of September, 1981. Sorry, Sean, but this is not going to be a normal incident report this time. I'm still pretty freaked out by this. It happened just before 11 a.m. I think 10:56 a.m., but mostly I'm guessing. Do you remember that guy from redacted address job? The guy in the woods. He showed up, Sean. He fucking showed up at this place. This place is like 10 fucking miles away, next to an entirely different set of woods. I looked up at one point, and he was just there. He was still in that long jacket with his hat pulled down over his eyes, and he had a scarf now that hid his mouth a bit too. I immediately went over to the guy he was talking to, that new kid that started with us, and I managed to hear him asking the kid if he'd seen a dog. I asked him what the hell he was doing on the property, and I think he recognized me, because his whole demeanor changed. He went from a bit stiff but open to an almost defensive stance, and his voice was low. He said he was seeing if anyone had seen a dog. I asked him what kind, and he said a little brown one. But when he tried to describe the thing, it sounded more like a deer. I told him no one's seen one and that he needed to leave, and he took a step toward me and stared at me like he was trying to intimidate me. I didn't back down, and the kid was looking between us nervously, and eventually the guy said he'd leave and nodded to the kid. I tried to reassure the kid it was just some weirdo, same as you did after the guy first showed up, but when I looked behind him, this guy looked wrong. His legs and arms were too long, and he was taking these huge backward steps while he looked at me. And I swear to God, he fucking smiled at me. I can't deal with this shit again, Sean. If he shows up again, I'm out. Brigham. Last name redacted. A part of me remembered the whole Slender Man thing that was popular when I was younger, and I almost laughed. But but the fear in this report stopped me. The last 2 reports were a little shaken, especially the second one. But this, it sounded like he was terrified of this guy. As if by reflex, I looked up at the window, and I felt a little dumb when it was the same as it had been before I started reading, aside from a bit darker. I probably would have to wrap up soon, but I desperately wanted to finish these so I'd know how many of these to put aside. The next paper was his letter of resignation. Sean, I'm sorry. It's been great working with you, but I'm done. I told you if that thing showed up again, I was out, and I'm out. I know you don't believe me, even with the kid backing me up. And the fact that you say I was hazing him to make you believe this prank honestly was the last straw. You weren't there. You didn't talk to this thing. You didn't see this thing. And you never believed the pictures from the last few days of redacted last name, job. So I'm done. I'll get my tools after the job is over so the guys can use them. But once it's over, I'm picking them up. I thought we were friends, Sean. I thought that you'd believe me with all the goddamn proof I'd put on your desk after last time. I guess I was wrong. Best of luck, man. Brigham. Last name redacted. The letter was handwritten in quick, shaky letters that made me think he had been upset when he wrote it. And the fact that it looked like it had been crumpled up at one point gave the impression that this hadn't been the actual letter he turned in. Even if it wasn't, it said a lot about this thing and how much it bothered him. Not only that, it said there were pictures somewhere. Again, I shuffled through the pile to see if there was anything there. And again, I came up empty. Worse, I knew there wouldn't be any more incident reports. I started organizing again, wanting to get to the last drawer. And something came up from a few years later that caught my attention. Notice to all employees of redacted last name, contracting and landscaping. Effective February 11th, 1987. The following protocol is now in place. Any unfamiliar personnel approaching a site must be immediately reported to myself or the lead contractor for that particular site. All employees must also report any strange activity in the surrounding area or signs of tampering with any tools, equipment, or personal items. Anyone seen talking to unfamiliar personnel will receive disciplinary warning, and anyone seen accompanying them off-site will receive serious disciplinary action, in addition to removal from the site for the remainder of the job. This protocol is for the safety of the staff and clients and will not be treated lightly. Any questions about this change should be directed to myself by requesting a private meeting. Thank you for your compliance, and let's continue to do our best work. Brigham, last name redacted. What had happened in those 6 years that he would mention going with someone off-site? Why did he emphasize it was for staff and client protection? I don't know, and there was no guarantee that I would find out. But God, did I hope so. After this, there was a handful of reports, some from the same job, and others from ones that were months to years apart. And they were short due to the fill-in. Form that Brigham had seemed to whip up after this notice. This is what the blank ones look like. Name, position, site, date, and space for a description of the incident. It was roughly one of the size of those feedback sheets you might get from a doctor's office, about half a normal sheet of printer paper. Still, what there was defined was telling. Name, Peter, last name redacted. Position, apprentice contractor. Site, redacted address. Date, November the 10th, 1987. Description of incident. While I was waiting for my trainer to get back from his lunch break, a guy in a hat and a jacket came up to me. I'm not sure where he came from, since I just finished lunch too. He asked me if I knew where the nearest house was. I'm assuming other than the one he was out. And when I told him how far it was, he asked me to bring him over. My trainer came back around then and cussed him out, and the guy walked off. No idea where though. It was basically the opposite direction of the road. Name, Morgan. Last name redacted. Position, painter. Site, address redacted. Date, April 28th, 1988. Description of the incident. While I was walking back to the site from my car, a guy walked out from the woods and asked for my help. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was lost and needed to use a phone. When I told him we didn't have permission to go in the house, he asked me to drive him to a store or something to use their phone. I went to ask you about it, and by the time I came back with you, he was gone. Name, Elliot. Last name redacted. Position, assistant contractor. Site, address redacted. Date, March 7th, 1992. Description of the incident. My car had a slashed tire when I went to head out for the day, and some guy in a coat came up and offered to help me fix it or bring me where I needed to go. He wasn't with us or the client, so I have no idea where in the hell he came from. I said no and went to go ask one of the crew for help, and I saw him go into the woods. Name, Theo. Last name redacted. Position, landscaping. Site, address redacted. Date, March 10th, 1993. Description of incident. My wife came with the baby to drop off lunch, and when she got back in the car, some guy was holding my daughter. She started freaking out and shouting at him, but he ignored her and started taking the baby towards the woods. Luckily, I heard her and ran at the guy. It's kind of a blur after that. My wife can't really tell me what happened either. My daughter was in my arms and fine other than crying, and the guy was gone. I stopped reading at that last one. It honestly made me a bit sick. I couldn't imagine being in that situation, seeing someone I cared about so vulnerable and in such a strange position. I couldn't imagine what the hell happened to make him and his wife forget either. Again, I felt the urge to look back at the window. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away like it had before. I suddenly wanted to get through this as soon as possible. I finished organizing the papers, only finding a few more reports that were worth setting aside, and I was finally ready for the last drawer. I wish I left it locked sometimes. The pictures that were mentioned before were there, presumably from the hunting camera he bought off his old boss, and they were unsettling to say the least. A few were just bits it had caught as the guy went by. A blurry hand, the end of a long sleeve, the top of a hat, a vague humanoid shape in the distance. But there were two that really stood out. In one, he was standing in front of the camera as if he was posing. He wasn't particularly tall or thin, but something about his proportions just seemed off, and after looking at it for a bit, I remembered what one of his reports had said, and realized it was because his legs and arms were just too long for his body. The jacket was more like a trench coat, and almost went to his ankles. The dark gray that was just kind of light enough not to be black, and the hat he wore looked like a fedora. In fact, he kind of reminded me of the stereotypical detective in that getup, aside from the coat not being brown or beige. Even the sunglasses fit with this look. While I was looking at the sunglasses, I noticed his nose was barely differentiated from the rest of his face, and his smile seemed too wide. The other picture, on the other hand, I might as well be looking at it, even knowing it's in one of the decorative boxes the family didn't want. The man was on all fours, arms and legs twisted in odd angles like a spider, and the glasses had fallen off to reveal he had no eyes. No fucking eyes. Just the indents where they were supposed to be in his skull, and these small holes that reminded me of the dots you put on a smiley face. And God, that smile was so wide it literally stretched from ear to ear, and the toothy grin felt like it had far more teeth than it should have. Even though they didn't look sharper than a normal human, it took a bit to realize his head was too far tilted as well, as if it had been glued to the side of his neck instead of attached normally. It felt like that fucking thing could see me through the picture. I hated looking at it. I hated it looking at me. I stuffed it somewhere in the center of the others. The only other thing in that drawer was a newspaper article from February 2nd, 1987. An article about a middle schooler who had gone missing right from her own yard. One who was last seen talking to a man in a jacket and a hat, according to the mother, who seemed to be asking the girl for directions. I was done. I couldn't read anymore. I put anything else that looked like it might make the family as sick as I felt aside to take with me. And I started to bring the boxes out to go over the contents with the family before nightfall. The son was at the door of the workshop as I opened it, looking like he had been about to knock. "Oh, sorry man, I hope I didn't scare you." I apologized. No, I was just wondering if you had anyone else working with you." I felt cold, ice cold. When I tried to swallow, there suddenly wasn't enough spit to even do that. No, why? There was this guy outside of the shed before I came out here to ask if he was with you. Looked like a cop or something, maybe? It seemed like he was looking in, like he wasn't sure if he should knock or something. The kid explained, seeming as confused as I was. A cop? Well, I mean, not like a normal cop. He had one of those coats from the old detective movies, so I wasn't sure how else to describe him. I think that was the fastest I've ever wrapped up a job, though I did at least warn them that if they saw that guy, he wasn't with me and to call the cops. I wasn't sure what else to tell them. Hey, your husband/dad seemed to have pissed off some eldritch abomination. Maybe it's not sure if he's dead. What the hell was the point of taking those secrets with me then? The box stays in one of my shelves in the museum now. Usually, I try to forget it's there. When I remember, I usually have nightmares or get paranoid there's someone outside. I hope that's not the case tonight, especially since I had to get the notes to type them up. If you have any questions or a name you'd like to check, feel free. I might like the company, just in case I do have trouble sleeping. I ask you, share my voice with others. Let them know that there is warmth in the cold, light in the darkness. My friends, lovers, disciples, this is Dante.